The ship rocked gently beneath her feet, but Nurse Akiko Hayashi's world had already been turned upside down. She pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the transport vessel, watching an American sailor offer her friend a cigarette with a smile that seemed impossible. Everything she had been taught, everything she believed about the enemy, crumbled a little more with each act of unexpected kindness. These men were supposed to be demons. Instead, they looked like they had stepped from a film screen, tall and clean and impossibly well-fed. How could this be? How could the monsters have such gentle hands? The date was August 30th, 1945. The war was over, though for Akiko and the 43 other Japanese women aboard the USS transport ship, it felt like a strange new chapter was only beginning. They huddled together on the deck, a collection of nurses, radio operators, clerical workers, and civilian employees who had been captured in various Pacific locations as the empire collapsed. Most wore the same clothes they had been wearing when taken prisoner, thin cotton blouses and worn skirts that did little against the ocean wind. Some clutched photographs in their hands, faces of men who would never return. Others held small satchels containing the meager possessions that represented entire lives left behind. Akiko had served as a military nurse in Saipan before the island fell. She had seen horrors that no 24-year-old woman should witness. She had held dying soldiers, their bodies wasted from starvation and disease, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that they were losing everything. The propaganda broadcasts had sustained her through those dark months, the radio voices promising that Japan would prevail, that the Americans were savage barbarians who would show no mercy, that their physical appearance alone, with their ghostly pale skin and animal features, would inspire revulsion and fear. But when the Marines had stormed through the medical station where she worked, none of them had claws. None of them had fangs. They were just young men, exhausted and wary, who secured the building with swift efficiency and then, to her complete bewilderment, offered her water from their canteens. One had even apologized, in broken Japanese, for frightening her. Now, 6 days into the voyage across the Pacific, she found herself observing her captors with an attention that felt almost shameful. The guards who patrolled the deck were unlike any men she had encountered in Japan. They stood at least a head taller than most Japanese soldiers, their shoulders broad, their movements confident and relaxed. They spoke in booming voices and laughed easily with each other. Their uniforms were crisp and clean, their boots polished to a shine. Most striking of all, they looked healthy in a way that seemed almost obscene. Their skin had color. Their frames carried actual muscle and weight. They did not move with the exhausted shuffle of men pushed beyond endurance. A sailor approached the cluster of women with a box in his hands. He was young, perhaps 20, with red hair that caught the afternoon sun like copper wire. Freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks. He crouched down to their level, his movements slow and deliberate, clearly trying not to frighten them. "Sandwiches," he said, opening the box to reveal thick slices of bread with generous portions of meat and cheese between them. "You ladies hungry?" The women stared at the food with wide eyes. One of the younger girls, Fumiko, who had been a typist at a naval office in Manila, made a small sound in her throat. The bread was white and soft, not the tough, gritty mixture of sawdust and rice flour they had been subsisting on for months. The meat looked real, substantial. There was lettuce, crisp and green. A smear of what appeared to be mayonnaise glistened on one slice. "Go on," the sailor encouraged, his smile genuine and unguarded. "There's plenty." Slowly, tentatively, hands reached out. Akiko took a sandwich, the bread yielding under her fingers. She bit into it and had to suppress a sound that was half moan, half sob. The flavors exploded in her mouth after so long eating nothing but thin soup and moldy rice. The meat was turkey, she thought, or perhaps ham. The bread was soft and slightly sweet. She chewed slowly, trying to make it last, trying not to think about how this simple sandwich represented more abundance than most people in Japan had seen in years. The sailor watched them eat with an expression that Akiko struggled to interpret. It was not contempt or mockery. It looked almost like sadness, or perhaps pity. When Fumiko began to cry quietly while eating, he shifted uncomfortably and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you." After he left, the women sat in silence, finishing their food. Finally, Yuriko, a former clerk who was the oldest among them at 38, spoke in a low voice. "They are not what we were told." The simple statement hung in the air. Several women nodded. Others looked away, unwilling to acknowledge what they were all thinking. That night, lying in the cramped quarters below deck, Akiko listened to whispered conversations in the darkness. The women shared their observations like contraband, speaking of things they barely dared admit even to themselves. "Did you see the one with the blonde hair? Like gold thread. They smell clean, like soap and something else. Something sweet." The tall one smiled at me today, not in a cruel way, just smiled. "My brother died at Guadalcanal. He wrote that the Americans were monsters. But these men, they don't look like monsters. They are too tall. It is unsettling. No, it is..." A pause, a breath. "It is impressive." Akiko pressed her face into her thin pillow, guilt washing over her. Her fiancé, Takashi, had been a naval officer. They had exchanged letters for 2 years before his ship was sunk somewhere near the Philippines. His last photograph showed a gaunt young man with hollow cheeks and eyes that held too much weariness for his 26 years. He had been handsome once, she remembered, but the war had consumed him, stripping away everything soft until only bones and duty remained. How could she look at these American sailors, so robust and alive, and feel anything but hatred? Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw that red-haired boy's kind smile, saw the way he had crouched down to their level to avoid towering over them, saw the genuine concern in his eyes when Fumiko cried. These small courtesies felt like betrayals of everything she should believe. The days at sea developed a rhythm. Breakfast arrived promptly at 7 in the morning, carried by sailors who wished them good morning in cheerful voices. The food continued to astonish. Oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, eggs scrambled with butter, strips of bacon that glistened with fat. Coffee, real coffee, bitter and hot and wonderful. The women ate carefully at first, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle such richness after years of deprivation. Some became sick. The medical officer, a doctor with gray hair and gentle hands, checked on them daily, prescribing smaller portions and plain crackers until their bodies adjusted. On the 4th day, they were allowed to take showers. The women filed into a bathroom facility that seemed impossibly luxurious, with multiple shower heads and unlimited hot water. Akiko stood under the spray, letting it soak her hair and run down her body, washing away months of grime and sweat. She had not felt truly clean since before Saipan fell. The soap they were given smelled like lavender, a scent so beautiful it made her throat tight. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel that was rough but clean, she caught sight of herself in a fogged mirror. Her own face looked foreign, her eyes too large in a face that had grown thin and angular with deprivation. A sailor stood guard outside the bathroom, ensuring their privacy. He was different from the others, older perhaps, with dark hair graying at the temples and serious eyes. When the women emerged, he handed each of them a comb and a small bag. "Toiletries," he explained, demonstrating with gestures. "Toothbrush, toothpaste, soap for your personal use." Inside the bag, Akiko found items that seemed impossibly precious. A real toothbrush with firm bristles, a tube of toothpaste that smelled of mint, a bar of soap identical to what they had used in the shower, a small jar of cream labeled hand lotion. She opened it cautiously and sniffed. The scent was delicate, floral. When she rubbed a small amount into her cracked, work-roughened hands, it absorbed smoothly, leaving her skin soft. That evening, the women gathered on deck during the permitted exercise hour. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. A group of sailors sat nearby, playing cards and listening to music from a portable phonograph. The song was something jazzy and upbeat, with a trumpet leading the melody and a woman's voice crooning lyrics in English that Akiko could not understand but found oddly appealing. One of the sailors noticed them watching and waved them over. The women hesitated, but curiosity proved stronger than caution. They approached slowly, staying clustered together for safety. "You ladies like music?" the sailor asked. He had a broad, friendly face and an accent that sounded different from the others, slower and more drawn out. "This here's Billie Holiday. Best voice in America." He increased the volume slightly, and the music filled the evening air. Some of the women swayed slightly, responding to the rhythm despite themselves. The sailors went back to their card game, occasionally glancing over to smile but not pushing for interaction. It was a strange moment, peaceful in a way that felt almost surreal. The enemy and the defeated, sharing the same deck, listening to the same music as the sun disappeared into the Pacific. A young sailor, barely more than a boy with a face full of acne and earnest brown eyes, pulled out a sketch pad and began to draw. He worked quickly, his pencil moving with confident strokes. After several minutes, he tore out the page and approached the women shyly. "For you," he said, offering the sketch to Yuriko, who happened to be closest. The drawing showed the women as they had been moments before, clustered together on the deck with the sunset behind them. His skill was evident. He had captured something in their expressions, a mixture of sadness and cautious hope. Yuriko accepted the sketch with both hands, bowing slightly in thanks. The sailor's face broke into a pleased grin. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said, then returned to his companions. Later, in their quarters, the women passed the sketch around, studying it by the dim electric light. "Why are they kind to us?" Fumiko asked, her voice small and confused. "We are the enemy. We lost the war. They should hate us." Nobody had an answer. The kindness felt inexplicable, almost cruel in its own way. It would have been easier, Akiko thought, if the Americans had been monsters. Hatred was simple. Hatred made sense. But this confusing mixture of gratitude and guilt and unwanted admiration, this was torture of a different kind. On the 8th day at sea, one of the women fell ill. Sachiko, a quiet radio operator who rarely spoke, developed a fever that spiked alarmingly high. The medical officer was summoned immediately. He examined her with professional efficiency, then ordered her moved to the ship's infirmary. Akiko, as the only trained nurse among the prisoners, was allowed to accompany her. The infirmary was clean and well-stocked, with proper medical equipment and a pharmacy that made Akiko's breath catch. During the final months in Saipan, she had been reduced to reusing bandages and operating without anesthesia because supplies had run out. Here, there were bottles of medications lined up neatly on shelves, sterilization equipment, proper surgical tools. The doctor worked quickly to stabilize Sachiko, starting in 4 to combat dehydration and administering antibiotics for what he suspected was a bacterial infection. "You're a nurse," he said to Akiko, not a question but a statement. "I could use your help monitoring her tonight if you're willing." She nodded, and he showed her where supplies were kept, how to check the for, what symptoms to watch for. He treated her as a colleague, not a prisoner, explaining things clearly and listening when she asked questions. His Japanese was limited, but he had a medical dictionary, and they managed to communicate through a combination of broken language and shared professional knowledge. Through the long night, as Sachiko slept fitfully, the doctor told Akiko about his practice back home in Oregon. He had 3 daughters, he said, showing her photographs from his wallet. He had volunteered for military service despite being past draft age because he felt it was his duty. He missed his family terribly but was proud to serve. His voice when he spoke of his daughters was warm with affection. "You remind me of my oldest," he said to Akiko. "She's studying to be a nurse too." Same determined look in her eyes. The comparison should have felt insulting, but instead it touched something deep in Akiko's chest. She thought of her own father, a schoolteacher who had died during an air raid on Tokyo. He had been proud of her nursing career too. For a moment, the lines between enemy and friend blurred into something more human. 2 people who had lost things and feared for those they loved, sitting in an infirmary while a sick woman slept. By morning, Sachiko's fever had broken. The doctor smiled, clearly pleased with the outcome. "Good work, Nurse Hayashi," he said, using her name for the first time. "She'll be fine now." The use of her name, said with respect, almost undid her. She bowed deeply, unable to express in words what his kindness meant, then returned to her companions to report that Sachiko would recover. On the 10th day they sighted land. America. The women crowded the railing, straining to see the coast emerging from the morning mist. The sailors grew more animated, pointing and calling out to each other. They were home, or as close to home as a military ship came. For the women, this was the edge of an unknown world, a place they had been taught to fear and hate, now revealed in the clear light of an early September morning. As the ship maneuvered into port, the scale of America's infrastructure became visible. Massive docks stretched along the waterfront, swarming with activity. Cranes lifted cargo containers with mechanical precision. Warehouses lined the shore, each one larger than entire city blocks in Japan. Ships of all sizes crowded the harbor, military vessels and commercial freighters and fishing boats, all moving in an organized chaos that spoke of prosperity and power. But what struck the women most forcefully were the people. As the transport ship docked, they could see American servicemen lined up along the pier, waiting to assist with unloading. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, and they were all so tall, so impossibly uniformly tall and well-built. After years in Japan where malnutrition had become the norm, where men grew up stunted by insufficient food and the strain of endless war, these Americans seemed like giants. Their shoulders were broad, their frames solid with muscle. They stood with confident postures, laughing and joking with each other, their voices carrying across the water. "Look at them," Fumiko whispered, gripping Akiko's arm tightly. "They are all so." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. But Akiko knew what she meant to say. They were all so handsome. It was a shameful thought, a traitorous thought, but undeniable. The men on that pier, in their service uniforms with their healthy faces and strong bodies, represented everything that had been missing from Japan for years. They looked like movie stars, like propaganda posters come to life, except the propaganda had claimed they were ugly and monstrous. An older woman, Keiko, who had worked as a secretary in the Manila headquarters, spoke bitterly. "This is why we lost. Look at them. Look at what they have. We were fighting this." Her words carried the weight of revelation. The true horror was not in American cruelty, but in American abundance. They had been told Japan was winning, that the American people were weak and soft, that their soldiers were poorly equipped and cowardly. Every single claim had been a lie. The evidence stood before them now, undeniable and overwhelming. The gangway was lowered, and the women were instructed to disembark. They descended in single file, carrying their small bags, their heads bowed against the stares of hundreds of soldiers. But despite their attempts at invisibility, they could not help stealing glances at the men who lined their path. One soldier had hair the color of wheat fields, so blonde it was almost white in the bright sunshine. Another had eyes of startling blue, like the ocean on a clear day. A third had a jawline so sharp it could have been carved from stone. They were not uniform in appearance, these Americans. Their faces showed evidence of different ancestries, European features predominating but with variations that spoke of diverse origins. Some had dark hair, others red or brown or blonde. Some had pale skin that burned easily in the sun, others olive complexions, a few with deeper tones that suggested African heritage. What united them was not their appearance but their bearing. They stood tall, these men. They looked well-rested, well-fed, confident. They represented a nation that had fought a war on two fronts and emerged victorious, barely touched on its home soil, its industrial capacity intact, its people prosperous. Japan had mobilized everything, sacrificed everyone, and still lost. The injustice of it felt crushing. The women were loaded onto military trucks for transport to the internment facility. As they drove through the city, they pressed their faces to the small windows, drinking in their first views of America. The streets were clean and well-maintained, the buildings tall and undamaged by bombing. Cars, so many cars, moved through traffic in an endless stream. Civilians walked the sidewalks in clean clothes, looking well-fed and content. Shop windows displayed goods in abundance, more food and merchandise than the women had seen in years. It is like they are not at war at all, one woman murmured in amazement. They were at war, Yuriko corrected gently. They simply won. The truck carried them out of the city, through countryside that looked impossibly fertile. Fields stretched to the horizon, crops growing thick and healthy. Farmhouses stood prosperous and maintained, with actual glass in the windows and painted exteriors. Livestock grazed in pastures, fat and healthy. This was the enemy's heartland, untouched by conflict, thriving while Japan burned. The internment camp, when they reached it, was nothing like what Akiko had imagined. Based on stories she had heard of American prison camps, she had expected cruelty and deprivation. Instead, she found order and adequacy. The facility was located in what appeared to be a repurposed civilian conservation corps camp in the Midwest, with rows of wooden barracks arranged in neat lines. A fence surrounded the perimeter, but it looked more like a formality than a serious barrier. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the soldiers manning them looked bored rather than vigilant. They were processed through an intake building where their names were recorded, their photographs taken, and their meager possessions catalogued. Then they were issued clothing, simple cotton dresses and undergarments, all new and clean, shoes that actually fit, a jacket for cold weather. The abundance felt obscene when she thought of people in Japan wearing rags and going barefoot because there was nothing else available. The barracks assigned to the women was spacious enough for all 44 of them, with real beds instead of sleeping mats on the floor. Each bed had 2 blankets, a pillow, and sheets. A wood stove in the center of the room would provide heat when the weather turned cold. Windows with actual glass let in natural light. At one end of the barracks was a communal bathroom with sinks, toilets, and showers, all with running water that came out hot if you waited long enough. That first evening in the camp, dinner was served in a mess hall that could have accommodated hundreds. The women filed through a line where servers heaped their plates with food. Pot roast with gravy, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, fresh bread with more butter, and for dessert, apple pie with a flaky crust and cinnamon sweet filling, coffee or milk to drink. The portions were enormous, more than any of them could possibly eat. Akiko sat at a long table with her companions, staring at her plate. The smell alone was overwhelming, rich and savory and real. Slowly, she picked up her fork and began to eat. The meat was tender and flavorful, the potatoes smooth and creamy, the beans cooked to perfection. Tears leaked from her eyes as she chewed, and she was not alone. All around her, women were crying while they ate, overwhelmed by the simple fact of abundance after so long with nothing. A guard approached their table, concern evident on his face. He was young and broad-shouldered, with brown hair and green eyes that reflected genuine worry. "Is the food okay?" he asked. "Is something wrong?" Yuriko, who spoke the most English among them, managed to compose herself enough to respond. "Food is very good. We cry because we have not eaten like this in very long time. Thank you." The guard's expression softened into something like understanding, or perhaps guilt. "You're welcome, ma'am. There's plenty more if you want seconds. Just take your time. Okay? Don't make yourselves sick." After dinner, they were shown to a recreation area where other prisoners, mostly German and Italian POWs from the European theater, spent their evening hours. There were card tables, board games, a phonograph with a collection of records, even a small library of books. The guards moved among the prisoners with casual familiarity, sometimes joining card games or engaging in conversation. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost collegial. It bore no resemblance to the brutal captivity the women had expected. Over the following days and weeks, a routine established itself. Wake at 7 for breakfast, then assign duties. Light work like cleaning the barracks or assisting in the mess hall kitchen. Lunch at noon, more duties in the afternoon, free time in the evening, dinner at 6, then recreation until lights out at 10. The work was easy, the food abundant, the conditions comfortable. Medical care was available through the camp infirmary, staffed by military doctors and medics who treated everyone with professional courtesy. The guards rotated on different shifts, but certain faces became familiar. There was Corporal James Morrison from Iowa, a farmer's son with a perpetual sunburn and a gentle manner who taught some of the women how to play baseball during recreation periods. Private David Chun, whose grandparents had immigrated from China, spoke a little Japanese and served as an unofficial translator when needed. Sergeant Robert Williams, an older career soldier with a serious demeanor but a kind heart, who could be seen reading letters from his wife and children during quiet moments. These men treated the women with a respect that felt almost surreal. They opened doors, carried heavy items, spoke politely, and never raised their voices in anger. Some went out of their way to be helpful, bringing extra blankets when the weather turned cold, sharing magazines and newspapers, teaching English phrases to those interested in learning. A few even brought photographs of their families, sharing stories of home with a nostalgia that transcended enemy lines. Akiko found herself developing an unwanted fascination with her captors. She studied them during meals, during work assignments, during the evening recreation hours. She noted the way they moved, confident and relaxed, never with the rigid military bearing she had seen in Japanese soldiers. She observed their casual interactions with each other, the friendly teasing and easy laughter that suggested deep camaraderie. She listened to their conversations, picking up English words and phrases, beginning to understand the rhythm of their language. What disturbed her most was the physical attraction she could not deny. These American men, with their height and strength and healthy good looks, represented everything her fiancé had not been. Takashi had been a good man, intelligent and kind, devoted to duty and honor. But he had also been thin and tired, worn down by war, his body reflecting the deprivation they had all endured. When she tried to remember his face, it was increasingly overlaid by the faces of the Americans she saw every day, men who had never known true hunger, whose bodies had been built up with good food and whose spirits had not been broken by inevitable defeat. The guilt was crushing. How could she look at the enemy and see anything but monsters? How could she find them attractive when her own people, her own fiancé, had died fighting them? Yet she was not alone in these shameful thoughts. She heard other women whispering late at night, confessing their confusion, their guilt, their unwanted awareness of American masculine appeal. The tall one with the dark hair, he smiled at me today, Fumiko whispered one night. I found myself smiling back before I could stop myself. What is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you, Keiko replied, her voice heavy with resignation. They are handsome. They are healthy. They are kind to us. These are simply facts. We cannot pretend otherwise. But we should hate them, another woman insisted. They killed our soldiers. They destroyed our cities. They are the reason we lost everything. Yes, Yuriko agreed quietly. And yet they feed us better than Japan fed its own people even before the war. They treat us with more dignity than our own military showed us when we were no longer useful. What does this say about us? What does it say about everything we believed? The questions hung unanswered in the darkness. There were no good answers, only uncomfortable truths that challenged everything they had been taught about the world and their place in it. As September turned to October, the weather grew cooler and the trees surrounding the camp burst into brilliant autumn colors. The women had never seen a true autumn before, and despite everything, they found beauty in the transformation. Red and gold leaves fell from the trees, carpeting the ground in rustling color. The air grew crisp and clean, smelling of wood smoke from the barrack stoves. During this time, Akiko began assisting in the camp infirmary on a regular basis. The medical officer, Captain Harold Peterson, the same doctor who had treated Sachiko on the ship, had requested her help when he learned of her nursing background. She worked alongside him and his medics, treating minor injuries and illnesses among the prisoner population. The work gave her purpose, something to focus on besides the confusing swirl of emotions that plagued her quieter moments. Captain Peterson was an excellent teacher, sharing medical knowledge freely and valuing her input. He had studied some tropical diseases in preparation for Pacific service and was interested in her experiences treating soldiers in Saipan. They fell into a pattern of professional collaboration that felt almost normal, as if they were colleagues in a civilian hospital rather than captor and prisoner in an internment camp. One afternoon in late October, A young soldier was brought to the infirmary after injuring his hand during a work detail. The wound was not serious, but it required cleaning and stitching. Captain Peterson was occupied with another patient, so he asked Akiko to handle it. The soldier, Private William Davis, was clearly nervous about being treated by a Japanese nurse. He kept shooting uncertain glances at her as she prepared the supplies. He was young, barely 20, with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes that looked too innocent for someone in military uniform. "This might sting a bit," Akiko said carefully in English, having practiced the phrase. He blinked in surprise at hearing her speak his language, then nodded. She cleaned the wound with gentle efficiency, noting that he flinched but did not pull away. As she prepared the needle and suture, she could feel his eyes on her face. "You're real good at this," he said suddenly. "Gentle. The doc said you were a nurse back in Japan." "Saipan," she corrected quietly, concentrating on threading the needle. "I was nurse in Saipan." "That must have been rough," he said, his voice sympathetic. "I heard it was bad there. A lot of people died." She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. She had held dying men in that field hospital, had watched them slip away because she lacked the medicine or equipment to save them. She had watched civilians throw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender. She had seen horrors this fresh-faced boy could not imagine. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for what you went through. Nobody should have to see stuff like that." His apology, so unexpected and genuine, nearly broke her composure. She focused on suturing his wound with steady hands, counting stitches to keep her mind occupied. When she finished, she bandaged it carefully and stepped back. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, flexing his hand experimentally. "You did a real nice job. Better than some of the medics here." He paused, then added shyly, "You know, if things were different, if there hadn't been a war, I think we could have been friends. You seem like a real nice person." After he left, Akiko stood in the quiet infirmary, trembling slightly. Captain Peterson found her there a few minutes later, staring out the window at nothing. "You all right, Nurse Hayashi?" he asked. "He apologized to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That soldier. He apologized for the war. Why would he do that?" Captain Peterson was quiet for a long moment. "Because he's a good kid who understands that war makes victims of everyone. Because he can see you as a person, not just an enemy. That's the thing about this whole mess, you know. Most of us are just ordinary people who got caught up in something bigger than ourselves. We're not monsters, and neither are you." His words echoed in her mind for days afterward. "We're not monsters, and neither are you." It was such a simple statement, but it contained a truth that undermined everything she had been taught about the world. The propaganda had painted everyone in absolutes, good and evil, righteous and demonic. But reality was infinitely more complex and more human. As autumn deepened into early winter, rumors began circulating about repatriation. The war had been over for several months now, and arrangements were being made to return prisoners to their home countries. The news created mixed reactions among the women. Some were desperate to go home, to search for surviving family members, to begin rebuilding their lives. Others felt only dread at the thought of returning to Japan's ruins, to a country defeated and occupied, where food was scarce and hope even scarcer. Akiko found herself torn between conflicting desires. Part of her longed for home, for familiar landscapes and language, for whatever remained of the life she had known. But another part, a part she was ashamed to acknowledge, wanted to stay in this strange, comfortable captivity where food was plentiful and the guards treated her with respect and nobody expected her to carry the weight of a failed empire on her shoulders. She thought about what awaited her in Japan. Her father was dead, killed in the Tokyo firebombing. Her mother had died years earlier from tuberculosis. Her fiancé was gone, his ship resting on the ocean floor. She had cousins and aunt perhaps, if they had survived. But what kind of life could she rebuild in a country that had lost everything? She would be a defeated woman returning to a defeated nation, carrying nothing but memories of captivity and the shameful knowledge that her captors had shown her more kindness than her own government ever had. In mid-November, official word came down. Repatriation would begin in December. The women would be transported by ship back to Japan, to be released in Allied-controlled ports where they would be processed and allowed to return to their homes, such as they were. The news was met with tears, both of relief and sorrow. That evening, Captain Peterson called Akiko to his office. She went with trepidation, uncertain what he wanted. She found him sitting at his desk, looking tired and older than his 50-some years. "Sit down, Nurse Hayashi," he said, gesturing to a chair. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. "I wanted to talk to you before you leave," he began. "You've been an excellent assistant these past months. You have real skill as a nurse, and I think you could have a good career in medicine if you wanted to pursue it." "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with thoughtful eyes. "I've been thinking about writing you a letter of recommendation, something you could use if you decide to continue your nursing education. I don't know what opportunities will be available in Japan, but if there are any, this might help. I'd be proud to vouch for your abilities." The offer surprised her so much she could not immediately respond. A letter of recommendation from an American military doctor would be worthless in Japan, might even be dangerous if the wrong people learned of it. Yet the gesture itself, the acknowledgement of her professional competence, the investment in her future, touched her deeply. "I don't think," she started, then stopped. "Things will be very difficult in Japan. I do not know if I will be able to work as nurse again." "Maybe not right away," he agreed. "But things will get better eventually. Wars end, countries rebuild. When that happens, good nurses will be needed. Take the letter. Keep it somewhere safe. You never know when it might prove useful." He wrote it out by hand while she watched, his pen moving across the paper in confident strokes. When he finished, he signed it with a flourish and handed it to her in an envelope. "Good luck, Nurse Hayashi," he said, standing and offering his hand to shake. "I hope you find peace in whatever comes next." She took his hand, feeling the firm grip, the warmth of human contact offered without any ulterior motive. "Thank you, Captain Peterson, for everything, for your kindness. I will not forget it." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. The women sorted through their meager possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. They were allowed to keep the clothes they had been issued, the toiletries, any personal items accumulated during their captivity. Some of the guards brought gifts, small tokens of farewell. A deck of cards, a book, a photograph of the camp taken during autumn when the colors were at their peak. These gifts were accepted with bowed heads and quiet thanks, symbols of unlikely connections formed across enemy lines. On the night before their departure, there was an informal gathering in the recreation hall. Someone had organized it, Akiko never learned who, as a farewell celebration. Music played on the phonograph, something slow and melancholy. A few soldiers taught the women some American dance steps, leading them through simple movements with patient good humor. There was coffee and cookies, laughter that sounded almost genuine, a determined effort to end this strange chapter on a positive note. Corporal Morrison sought out Akiko toward the end of the evening. He held something in his hand, a small wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this," he said, offering it to her. "Something to remember America by. I hope that's okay." She unwrapped it carefully to find a small wooden box, handcrafted and polished smooth. Inside was a photograph of the camp in autumn, the trees blazing with color, and beneath it, a note in careful handwriting. "For Nurse Hayashi, who reminded us that compassion survives even war. May you find peace. James Morrison, Iowa." Akiko clutched the box to her chest, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She managed a bow, deep and sincere, and Morrison returned it awkwardly before walking away. The next morning, December 5th, 1945, the women boarded trucks for the journey to the port. The guards who had become familiar stood at attention as they departed, some waving, others simply watching with expressions that mixed relief and regret. The drive back through the countryside felt different now. The fields were brown with winter, the trees bare, but Akiko saw beauty in the starkness. a quiet dignity in the landscape that would endure long after all of them were gone. At the docks, another transport ship waited, this one bound for Japan. The women climbed aboard, their small bags clutched in their hands, their bodies healthy and well-fed in a way that would mark them as different when they returned home. As the ship pulled away from the pier, Akiko stood at the railing, watching America recede into the distance. She thought about the men she had met, the tall soldiers with their kind eyes and gentle hands. She thought about Captain Peterson and his daughters, about Morrison and his farm in Iowa, about young William Davis with his shy smile and earnest apology. These men had been her enemies. The propaganda had painted them as demons, as creatures less than human, as monsters to be feared and hated. But they had looked into her eyes and seen a person. They had treated her with dignity when they could have shown cruelty. They had fed her when she was hungry, healed her when she was sick, respected her skills and valued her humanity. They had been, in the end, simply men. Handsome men, yes, with their height and health that spoke of a prosperity Japan had never known. But more than that, they had been decent men, caught up in the same terrible machinery of war that had consumed her entire world. The coast of America disappeared into the morning mist, and Akiko turned away from the railing. The journey home would take weeks. What waited for her in Japan she could not imagine. Ruins, certainly. Hunger, probably. Grief and loss and the difficult work of rebuilding a shattered nation. But she would carry something back with her, a truth more powerful than any propaganda, more enduring than any hatred. She had seen the enemy. She had expected monsters and found men. She had been taught to hate and discovered the possibility of understanding. The revelation would stay with her for the rest of her life, a quiet knowledge that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the rhetoric of war, there were only human beings trying to survive, trying to be kind when they could, trying to hold onto their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. In her bag, carefully wrapped and hidden, she carried Captain Peterson's letter and Morrison's wooden box. Evidence of a time when enemies had treated each other with unexpected grace. She did not know if she would ever be able to use them, if they would help or harm her in the Japan she was returning to. But she would keep them. These small gifts from tall, handsome men who had shown her that even in the darkest times, compassion could survive. The ship sailed west, carrying them home. Behind them, America faded into memory. Ahead lay Japan, waiting to be rebuilt from ashes. And in between, 44 women carried stories they would rarely tell, truths too complicated for simple narratives, memories of kindness from those they had been taught to hate. Akiko closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for revenge or justice, but for understanding. For all the soldiers who would never come home on both sides of the war. For all the women who had lost everything. For all the families torn apart by decisions made far above their heads. And for the possibility, however distant, that someday the world might learn to see enemies as human beings first, before the shooting started, before the bombs fell, before the hatred took root and grew into something that consumed everything in its path. The war was over. The journey home had begun. And in her heart, she carried a truth that would never leave her. The handsome enemy had treated her with more kindness than she had dared to hope for, and that small mercy had changed everything she thought she knew about the world.